Welcome to the Kaleidoscope Podcast. It's your host, George Salis. Today, I'm excited to share a conversation with Garielle Lutz, author of some of the weirdest and most beautifully crafted short stories you'll ever come across. Lutz was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1955. Her most recent short story collection is Worsted, now in its second printing from Calamari Archive. Previous books include The Gotham Grammarian, also from Calamari Archive, and The Complete Gary Lutz from Tyrant Books. From 1997 to 2000, she edited fiction for Trope, an online journal of experimental poetry and prose. Before retiring, she was a professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh at Greensburg. After I spent a year and some change reading her collected stories, I was delighted to hear that she was coming out with a nearly 1,000-page book of nonfiction titled Backwardness, published by Long Flight Short Drive. It's a collection of mostly letters and notebooks that stretch from 1973 to 2023. She writes in the book, "I've been coping with apartmentality in all of its grossing and morbid forms since first living in roach-replete efficiency quarters in my yearly 20s. I could give you a kind of exploded view of the explodent loneliness and recreational miseries and bitter gastricity of people stacked up in tenantship in some brood of a building in a lesser city whose skyline is mostly notional. I could tell you things about that same sub-cohort of unlovelies once they ventured outside for some employment, or for another unsatisfying bite to eat, for a bit of pairing off for the nonce. Later, through the walls, it's almost as if I can read the fate lines of self-weary troublers coupling destructively. This is exactly what you get in Backwardness, and more. And now, enjoy our conversation." Hi, Garielle. How are you? Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, George. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to dive in and talk about your latest book, Backwardness, which takes the form of a collection of miserabilia, as you put it. In other words, diary excerpts, memos, emails, etc. I wanted to talk about the nature of a diary, which tends to be a quotidian text. How, as a writer, do you elevate such quotidian texts into something that we might call art? Because reading this was nothing like a quotidian act. It was a beautiful artistic achievement, one of the best books I've read in quite a while.
Oh, thank you. I never actually thought of it as a diary. When I was in high school, I did briefly keep a diary, which I unfortunately threw out maybe a year or two after I kept it. And this project consists of a lot of excerpts from letters that I wrote as an undergraduate and a graduate student. And then after that, I began keeping notebooks. So I never really thought of this as a diary, or not even as a journal, but just as essentially a loose notebook type of project. And it wasn't even a notebook in the standard sense, because everything was typed up until, I don't know, maybe like the mid or I guess the late 1980s. So other than the letters, I would often come home from work feeling frustrated and burned out. And I would just put a piece of paper into the typewriter and start typing to get things off my chest, or to get things out of my system. And then the typed pages would end up on the floor in no particular order. And I never dated these entries, or at least not for the most part. And then eventually I would pick up the papers on the floor and throw them into a box and then forget about them. So I guess what I was doing, well, I should say that, first of all, in response to your question, I feel that if ever I'm going to attempt to type up anything, I want to make it presentable. So what I discovered when I went through all those boxes of piled up typewritten papers, I often discovered multiple drafts of a single entry. So when I was assembling this book, I sort of combined things from the various drafts. The reason I bring this up is that I didn't think of this as any kind of art when I was writing it, but I just thought I had to make it as precise as I possibly could.
Mm.
And when I was writing this, I didn't really have any models in mind because, again, I started the letters when I was an undergraduate. So I didn't really have anything in mind. Although perhaps at the time I was a reader of Jack Kerouac, and some of his books have a kind of like a diaristic or journal-like quality. So maybe that was an influence. But I guess it wasn't until, I don't know, maybe I was in graduate school that I came across a little book by Joe Brainerd called I Remember. And that had a big effect on me. It's simply a book of statements, single sentence statements, beginning with I and remember. And then the object of the verb would be some kind of memory. So there weren't paragraphs, they were just sentences. And, things like, I remember gloating over the Christmas gifts I bought for my family, that sort of thing. So this is a sequence of random memories. And I knew it had some kind of major effect on me, but it wasn't influencing my writing, I don't think. I guess just my approach to recognizing how, as you put it, these quotidian little things have some kind of ultimate significance.
Mm.
In fact, as I've grown older, I tend to be drawn toward books that are just collections of letters. I'm really excited. I read last week that a 900-page selection of John Updike's letters are going to be published in October.
Mm. Oh, he was quite prolific, to say the least, and I think it was Martin Amis who said he may have had 4 desks in his study, one in which he wrote a short story, one in which he wrote a poem, one in which he wrote a novel, an essay, etc.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that statement, but it kind of makes sense because it seemed as if, well, I remember, I don't know if it was before he died or after that, somebody had remarked that he never seemed to have any kind of thought that he didn't write down.
And they said that in a negative way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm very fond of Updike. One reason is that he writes often about an area where I grew up, and he manages to get what that place looks like, it feels like on paper, like nothing else I've ever read. But also because he very much was concerned with the quotidian. In fact,
Yes.
he made some kind of statement somewhere along the line that he wanted to give he wanted to give the mundane its beautiful due. He wanted to give the mundane its beautiful due. And the books of his that I admire are the ones that aren't gimmicky and are simply often recollections of his childhood and his teenage years and his adulteries in the suburbs of Connecticut, Massachusetts. It's when he went off in other directions with a number of contrived novels that I just lost interest very, very easily. But he would just describe what he would see when he's lying in bed, looking at the walls, looking at the window, etc. And he captures the look of things in a way that, again, I've never really seen anybody succeed at. I think he's really the best describer of American life in, from the 1950s onward.
I'm glad to hear that, because Updike was a sort of formative writer for me when I started reading seriously. I read his Rabbit Run series of books, for instance, and I agree with what you say about his ability to write is unquestionable, even if the topics are usually the quotidian life, which I've sort of moved on from in my reading. Of course, there are exceptions, such as your own writing, which I never put the connection between your writing and Updike, but now that you mention it, I can see that. Of course, you take it to at least one other level, if not multiple levels. But going back to diaries, letter collections, are there any others that you've read at any time later on that you may have admired or felt in communion with? I often hear people praising Kafka's letters. and I would imagine that you might take kindly to them, as it were.
Yeah, I've read two of his collections. Each one was directed to a particular woman. I forget their names right now. The first one is very, very long. The second one is much shorter. And yeah, I love those. And especially what I loved about those was there were some letters in which he would describe at great length his work situation at the office of the insurance company where he worked. And he would describe his coworkers in a very amusing way. So yeah, those, but I read those only really in the past year or so. In fact, I just a few months ago, I got the most recent translation of, oh, I'm sorry, now I'm talking about the diary, his diary, because that was something I got into this year as well. And I got the most recent translation, which attempts to take the polish out of the previous translation, the translation by Max Brod. So often when I was reading the new translation, I had to go back to the first translation to figure out exactly what was being said, because the new translator wanted to retain the occasional awkwardness in Kafka's entries, whereas the original translation gave everything a high literary polish.
Mm.
So yeah, so I was reading his diaries and his letters and other letters and collections of that sort that I read. But this again was long after most of the material in this book was written. Sometime in I guess it was the 1990s or maybe the early 21st century, that a friend gave me a little book called Jeb and Dash, which was essentially a diary kept by a man working in some minor office job in Washington, D.C. And Jeb and Dash were two gay men, and this diary covered, I think, the 1920s through the 1940s. And I would not say that it was a very literary memoir or a very literary journal, but it certainly brought that life of those two men into really sharp focus. So I did enjoy that. And then Leonard Michaels has a collection of or a selection of journal entries called Time Out of Mind, and I really love that. And I think maybe above all, John Cheever's journals. They were first excerpts were first published serially in the New Yorker, either in I don't know if it was late 1980s or early 1990s when Robert Gottlieb had become the editor of the New Yorker. And I've never been really crazy about John Cheever's fiction other than parts of the second section of his novel Bullet Park. But his journals, I think, are just absolutely a masterpiece. And I've read those several times. And it's a very literary book. In fact, I think the style is more carefully worked there than in most of the fiction of his that I've read. So yeah, and then finally Virginia Woolf, and I just started reading her letters and mostly her letters, which are there's multiple volumes of them, and I especially love the letters in which she's simply recounting her day and what was she doing, and that's what I'm more and more drawn to as a reader. I just want to see how other people live.
Yes, I was going to ask that. Do you think the part of the appeal is living vicariously through these letters?
Yeah, I'm just realizing, what do other people do, to get from one end of the day to the other? What are the things that strike them? Things that they've seen. In fact, there's this old cliche that in relationships, the woman often asks the man, "Tell me about your day," and the men often don't want to recount that. But for me, that would be an ideal relationship in which not only somebody asked me what my day was like, and I could talk at great length about it, and then I would want to know everything about what was going on in their day as well. That's what fascinates me at this point in life.
I hear you. Have you read any Mark Doty?
No, I haven't. I know the name.
He's known mostly as a poet, but he also has memoirs, and he brings the poetic sensibility to not only everyday life, but also some of the more dramatic happenings in his life. I loved Firebird, which is his memoir of being a gay kid, going through that sort of awakening and dealing with ostracism, etc. And then also his memoir, Heaven's Coast, about the AIDS epidemic, but also just a beautiful love story between him and his late partner and dealing with death. Very beautiful. So if you want something that's written at an elevated level, in addition to everything else you're looking for. Those are a couple of recommendations after you've given me a nice handful of recommendations.
That sounds good. I'm going to look into that because I also saw a review in the New York Times just a few days ago about the collected journals of some Austrian woman writer. I can't think of her name right now. That also seems to have been written, excuse me, in the kind of elevated way that you just described in terms of Mark Doty.
Mm. You mentioned going back that you would come home from a day of work and then you would write or type as a form of catharsis, correct?
Yeah.
Could you talk more about writing as an act of catharsis and maybe even as an exercise of hope in a hopeless world?
I guess I thought that just by trying to get things down on paper with some degree of accuracy, I was, I guess, to resort to pop psychology terms, processing the frustrations and the humiliations of the day. Because I taught at the college and I taught primarily freshman composition courses, which consisted primarily of students who did not want to be there. So there would be a lot of embarrassments, humiliations, frustrations, sense of hopelessness during the day. So yeah, I would try to work that out in some way, often not describing what happened in the classroom, but describing what I did after I left school. Because for a long time, what I would do, I would leave school and I would just drive to shopping centers and walk through stores until it was time to go home, or really until the stores closed. So, and then I would observe strange things at the mall or the shopping center, and I would write about that kind of stuff.
Yes, reading the book as a whole just felt like this massive testament to creating something beautiful in the face of so many ugly or cold, or what's the word I'm looking for? Just a world, say, that doesn't care about us. But at the same time, I came across this sentence where you say English was the one language in which no hope was available, which seemed to kind of cancel out the feelings I had when reading. And so could you comment on that as far as writing as a catharsis or as an act of hope versus English language having no hope available within it?
Well, I've always been struck by the fact that English has far more words in it than, the European languages have, for example. So it would stand to reason that if you're trying to express something in English, you will be able to find the exact word
Mhm.
to express it. But every time I try to write, I come up against my own limitations as far as my vocabulary is concerned, and also the disappointment I would feel in the words themselves, that they weren't sufficiently communicating what I thought they were supposed to be communicating. So I've always found writing very maddening. It's not something I enjoy, although I've often felt compelled to do it. So yeah, I guess what I was trying to say in that sentence was that I often felt defeated, or almost always felt defeated, when I was trying to simply deliver an account of a walk or whatever I was attempting to describe. That I once read it, and I tried to emphasize this when I was teaching freshman composition, that every time you type a word, you have to realize that you've chosen that word at the expense of all the other words in the English language. And do you really feel that you found the right word for what you want to express? And I remember reading in some biography of Salinger that by the time he was writing Seymour an Introduction, and before he stopped publishing, that apparently he would have pieces of paper on which he would jot down maybe several dozen words as possibilities to fill a particular slot in a sentence.
Mhm.
And increasingly, but not to that extent, is what I would be doing, because I would type a word and then realize that's not it. And there's that old Mark Twain saying about the difference between the right word and the not quite right word. It's like the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. And
Mhm.
I would often feel that I haven't found the word that I need.
I'm thinking of Mad Libs where you can fill in various words. Is that more accurate than literature proper?
I remember as a kid seeing Mad Libs, and recently a friend of mine um, who has a child living with them told me that the child is obsessed with Mad Libs, and I hadn't even realized that Mad Libs were aimed at children. As a
Mm.
kid, I mean, as a kid, I was not a verbal kid at all. In fact, I had a hard time learning how to speak with any kind of exactitude or write with any kind of exactitude because I grew up in a household where there wasn't much talk at all. So I far behind in terms of my verbal abilities. So when I would see the Mad Libs at a store, I just assumed those can't be for kids because how could kids possibly fill those blanks? Because kids would not have the word stock that would be needed to
Mm.
participate in those.
Do you think the skill and the intellectual maturation as far as using language is a kind of way to compensate for that delay in childhood?
I think so. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, because even when I was in high school, I often mispronounced words. Or I remember one time I was supposed to say the word capacity and I said capacity. I just wasn't, I didn't have many visual and oral encounters with words.
I mean, even if you're reading a book, say you can't be 100% sure how it's pronounced, and I've found myself having to look that up sometimes in the past, and even now I'm still discovering words that I've mispronounced in one way or another.
Oh yeah, I'm still that way myself. And uh, I think one of my big problems as a kid was that I would even get idiomatic expressions wrong. For instance, one that I remember very vividly because it was humiliating. Instead of saying by hook or by crook, I said by hick or stick. And
Mm.
the person didn't know what I was talking about. And I remember one time, I don't know if I put this in the book, that I don't know, I guess it was in elementary school, and we went to visit some relatives, and there were two teenage girls in the family, and we played some kind of word game. And I wrote the word soup case because that's what I thought suitcase actually was. I thought
Mm.
soup.
Mhm.
So yeah, I was getting words wrong all the time.
The most recent in the past few years or so that I had a hard time wrapping my mind around, no pun intended, was that the word flaccid is actually pronounced flaccid.
Oh, yeah, and I don't know how I learned that. Well, I do know at some point, um, I think this was when I had a job in a writing center at a college. They had lots of cassette tapes of vocabulary words, and I would listen to the tapes, and yeah, I would realize that it was. I'm not sure at that point in my life where I had ever used the word formidable, but I would have pronounced it formidable.
Mm.
And I mean, there were so many words that I still feel uncomfortable speaking or using out loud because I haven't used them out loud ever before.
We are all of us Molly Blooms and pronouncing bass barrel tone and all the other words that she would accidentally coin.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember when I went off to graduate school, I was really impressed with how articulate these other students were. And um, I was not in that league at all. So
Mm.
I didn't talk very much in grade school.
Do you think it was because these are more that they socialize more? But I don't know if that would be a reason because, uh, mistakes can and do propagate as far as not only pronouncing words, but misusing them, etc.
Yeah,
So I'm not sure.
I think even though I went to a very undistinguished graduate school, a lot of the students in the graduate program in English were very sophisticated and came from sophisticated backgrounds. I mean, there was one woman, I didn't learn this until after she left, but her father was the dean of the medical college at Harvard.
Mhm.
And I mean, she was an extremely articulate person, but I had never known much about her actual, the specifics of her background.
Mhm.
And also, these were people that were, for the most part, older than I was. I made the mistake of entering grad school right after I got my undergraduate degree. So I was like 23 or 24, and these other students were at least in their early 30s.
Mhm. Going back to your latest book, Backwardness, it stretches about half a century. But what one thing I immediately found so surprising was that even from the very beginning, it reads like the Lutzian voice that I know and love from reading your collected stories, which is not to say that there isn't a progression. Your voice does get more Lutzian as it goes on, but still that seed or that aura, whatever you want to call it, is there from the beginning, which I don't think most writers can say that. Can you comment on that? Were you aware of that at all?
When I was going through these, for instance, two of the friends whose letters my letters from them, I include excerpts from in the book. Those had been out of my possession, for decades. But when I told them I was working on this project, when I was trying to reclaim my youth, they said they would send me the letters. And one of the friends, Keith Jones, had sent me a huge box in which he had arranged the letters as best he could by year, because some of the letters didn't have dates on them. And I was struck, because again, I hadn't seen these letters for decades. I was struck by the fact that obviously I'd put a lot of care, put a great deal of care when I was writing these letters. And I could often see, cross outs, things like that. So I was striving to express myself in a way that I wasn't in my coursework. Many of the letters to Keith Jones were written when I was in graduate school, and I did not do well in graduate school. I mean, I was in creative writing classes, but the stuff that I wrote in these classes was essentially garbage. But it seemed as though I was really putting a lot more effort, or just doing something differently in my letters, because I wasn't thinking in terms of the conventions that the creative writing teachers were talking about, because they were teaching a very traditional type of fiction writing. So
Yes.
I do realize that I spent so much time writing those letters, and I'm assuming rewriting them. I'm sure, even though I no longer have drafts, but I'm sure they must have gone through several drafts. So yeah, I mean, I knew at the outset when I first started writing letters, when I went off for my undergraduate years, I knew that there was something uncomfortably odd about the way I perceive the world, the way I express myself, in terms of my observations of the world. So I know there was a weirdness in my writing from the outset, in terms of the things that I saw when I looked at something, which might not have been the things that some other person would have seen.
Mm.
So I was aware that there was a weirdo
Mm.
quality to those letters, even at the outset.
That has me wondering, because with any collegiate workshop that I was a part of, all the conventions that they sort of impose on you that you mentioned, that, and even in fiction in particular, the professor was most happy when I mimicked his voice. So I'm wondering how many voices are not only getting squelched, but being transmogrified or bleached or diluted in these kinds of institutions. Do you think there are more voices out there that we could have had in letters and in fiction if
I think
if there was a better breeding ground, for lack of a better phrase?
I think so. I like the way you express that, because as a student in those writing workshops, I often felt as if I were being extinguished, that I had to essentially censor myself or try to be somebody else.
Mm.
Because, I mean, the first workshop that I took was was taught by a very successful commercial writer. And I recently just got rid of the book he had us buy, which it was actually a very well written book. It was called Technique in Fiction. And there would be a chapter on setting the scene, and then another chapter on exposition, another chapter on dialogue, and I just wasn't able to do that any of that. I That's why when I later came upon these weird books that turned out to have been edited by Gordon Lish,
Mm.
I felt that kind of writing was more hospitable to the type of person that I am, because I don't think in terms of plots at all. And that was a big thing in the graduate workshops, the plot, setting up the plot and working through the plot. And then, a character has to change by the end of it. I remember one time, this was, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, I was reading through some literary magazines, not any of the really big ones, but, literary journals published by, let's say, not major universities, but nevertheless, they would put out a literary journal. And there was one story whereby it was a relationship story involving a young man and a young woman. And the story ended with a statement such as, I could finally look her in the eye, as if up until that point, he'd been in a relationship with somebody that he never actually looked into the eyes of. And I thought, that's ridiculous. How can that be? And now we have, in the final sentence, you can finally look in her eye. So this goes back to what I've been taught. The main character has to change. And thing is, the kind of stories I like and the kind of stories I write, there's almost never any kind of change in the character at the end of
Mhm.
the story or the novel. The character instead is simply more of what the character was at the beginning. So yeah, I couldn't deal with those rules, and I was just really floundering and flailing in those courses. And in fact, in the very first workshop that I took, and I'd gone to grad school to be a poet, so I'd never even really written any fiction other than a stray story or two before then. So I took this workshop, and I was the first person to submit a work. I wrote the whole story during a weekend, and this was a workshop in which the writers were not allowed to participate in a discussion of their story. And somebody told me, class, that as he saw me during the discussion of my story, my head kept getting closer and closer to the tabletop. I mean, I was just bending my head. I was just bending forward because I was so distraught by all the terrible things that were being said about that story. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I did not flourish in grad school at all.
Oh, I feel you there because I had similar struggles, and it was also hard to sort of find the balance between one's own voice, but also not being so, in a sense, so unique that you're uh, saying, audience be damned, or anyone be damned on earth who could appreciate this. Yeah,
Yeah,
you understand what I'm getting at?
yeah, because in the poetry, because my second term in graduate school, I took a poetry workshop, and I didn't realize at that point in my life the extent to which my poetry was extremely solipsistic.
Mm,
So
yes.
nobody knew anything about what I was writing about, and I was trying to express private emotions, and again, it was just a complete failure. So somewhere along the line, well, I know that in the elements of style, E.B. White at one point says, "You can be obscure, but be obscure clearly." And I
Mhm.
had to learn how to be obscure clear because even well, with my fiction writing, I've often been accused of being solipsistic and that some of the stories make no sense whatsoever. And I think that as over the years, I've tried to be obscure more clearly in my own work. But yeah, back in graduate school, I mean, there was an emphasis, not an explicit emphasis, but there was an emphasis, an unspoken emphasis on imitation. You've got to
Mm.
imitate, and there was a point when I was trying to imitate the New Yorker style of fiction at the time, and again, I was failing at that as well.
Going back to what you said about being obscure, clearly, I mean, as long as there is at least one other person who you can connect with, or who can connect with you. But then the question is, maybe these types of readers have died out or are dying out. So
Yeah, I forget.
I'm
I
not
don't know if
sure what the solution would be, other than just staying true to yourself in your own voice.
that. Yeah, that's exactly what I've been trying to do because I don't feel as if I have any other choice. I mean, I am who I am. I write the way I write, and I don't feel motivated to change it to meet the needs of readers who probably wouldn't be the right or appropriate readers for my writing anyway. And
Mhm.
I recall, I don't know, a few decades ago, I think it was Philip Roth who said there are probably no more than 5,000 serious readers of literary fiction left. That might be an exaggeratedly low number, but um, I occasionally go into the local Barnes and Noble and look at the new fiction. I'll just pick books off the shelf and read part of a page or whatever, and I'm almost never interested enough to keep reading. I am not finding what I need in those
Yes.
books.
For the longest time, I couldn't find what I need, and then I found your complete stories, which kept me company every time I tried to branch out and read a novel here, a novel there, and found myself unstimulated. But then I could always fall back on the buoy of your book. over the course of a year or so. And then I was so glad to have another 1,000 pages or so to read of your work. And so going back to that, I mentioned, the progression, seeing your voice from the beginning being there and then progressing. But looking over these entries, did you notice any other kind of change, even if it were, say, some kind of inner growth? Or do you think, like your fiction, it sort of had a stasis? You said you don't like plot. Has your life also had a kind of stasis to it?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, my life really hasn't had a lot of the milestones that a person typically has in his or her life. So I think what I noticed when I was assembling all this material was that at some point, and I don't know exactly when this started to happen, I became fascinated with individual sentences. I remember, for example, the first time I came across the um, the work of Grace Paley. There was a 5 and 10 store, a variety store in the downtown district of the city where I grew up, Allentown, Pennsylvania, where they had this bin of coverless paperbacks, like they were 3 for a quarter. These would be books that had been returned from bookstores with the covers torn off to get some kind of rebate or whatever. And then it would end up in these bins, there were many places where I would find these coverless paperbacks. And I came across enormous changes at the last minute. And it was a rather thin book, so I decided to buy it. And I found it so different from any other fiction I'd ever read up until that time, because it seemed as if every sentence was an object unto itself. Yeah, there would just be this sequence of just wonderfully sculpted sentences. And gradually, in some kind of subtle fashion, I began to realize that maybe that's the kind of writing I want to do, and that's the kind of writing I want to attempt.
Mhm.
So I gravitated more towards sentences. At the same time, I was in a drugstore, and back in those days, drugstores would often have a revolving rack of mass market paperbacks of all sorts. And this one drugstore had a book whose title this really intrigued me. It was called Modern American Usage, and it was a very, I don't want to say scholarly, but an extremely erudite discussion of certain aspects of prose. So I bought it, and I was in high school at the time, and most of the discussion was well over my head. But there was a very long entry on the sentence, and it wasn't saying things about sentences that I would have expected to hear. I mean, as a kid of my generation, going to school in the 60s and the early 70s, either English teachers did not teach grammar or they taught it in a very superficial manner. And because I was convinced of my inadequacy as a speaker and writer of English, this book became a kind of refuge, and I would keep rereading it, even though I didn't understand it, because it was written by phenomenally intelligent people. The writer was Wilson Follett, but he died before finishing it, and was finished by Jacques Barzun. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, and also with contributions from people like Lionel Trilling. So it was a rather lofty book, but I kept rereading it, and things would eventually sink in. For example, there was a very persuasive discussion of the importance of the serial comma, and there was a discussion of something that is always and continues to bother me about certain elliptical constructions. When, well, an example would be something like, her poems were solipsistic, comma, her fiction less so.
Mhm.
Now, in a construction like that, you have to pull the plural verb from the first part of the sentence. Her poems were solipsistic. And then after the comma, there's an elliptical construction from which the verb has been deliberately omitted.
Mhm.
Her fiction less so. But the thing is, the empty slot where the verb should go, cannot be filled by the plural verb
Mhm.
earlier in the sentence. So that has always bothered me. And the thing is, in modern American usage, they say, that's okay.
Mhm.
Stylistically, it's okay. But then in some other some other book. I think it was a book I found in some used bookstore. It was actually a very early style sheet for the Atlantic Monthly. And this was from like early in the 20th century. And they had an entry upon about this kind of construction. And they said, no, the verb would have to agree in number with the verb in the prior phrase. So that was reassuring to me. And well, I guess what I'm trying to say to get back to your question is that I became more attentive to the sentence as a thing itself, in which the various components of the sentence have to be manipulated adroitly to fashion something that is going to be worthy of a reader's attention. So I think that's the one progression I probably noted in the writings in this book. It wasn't really a progression in like emotional maturity or anything. It was simply an increasing attentiveness to the sentence as something that needs to be carefully constructed and all the elements have to be carefully managed.
Yes. And I sort of homed in on what you said about a sentence needing to be worthy of the reader's attention, but then there's the question of finding readers who are worthy of the sentence. But we can leave that as it is and move
Oh,
on.
actually, though, I mean, at this point in my life, I realize that very few people are ever going to read what I've written, and that no longer bothers me. I never tried to be successful at
Mm.
all. I never had any ambition of being a writer that people would be aware of. So at some point, I just thought, I need to do what I want to do.
Yes, there's a liberation in that.
Yeah.
But one thing I love about your work is this kind of existentialism or fatalist existentialism that is there on a page by page, even a sentence by sentence degree. One example, I could probably flip through the book and find something at random, but one example is on page 394 where you write, "I had been born without much being." And it reminds me of some sentences that I've encountered with, say, David Foster Wallace's work in Infinite Jest. There's a sentence about a character who feels like he's wearing a four-piece suit, and he is the fourth piece, or the opening of Don DeLillo's Zero K. Not the opening, but at some point in Don DeLillo's Zero K, he writes, "I'm somebody who's supposed to be me." And I love these sentences that are, in a sense, horrific. It's a kind of mental body horror, if that makes sense. And your work, there's such a high degree of it that I can get my fix and then some. Can you comment on this kind of fatalist existentialism? And
Yeah, well, I do recall taking a philosophy course in which there was a unit on existentialism, and I don't really have a capacity to manage abstractions, so I never really understood much about any kind of philosophy, even though I read this stuff, but I've forgotten it. But I do remember existence precedes essence, and I guess a lot of my own writing arises out of a sense of complete alienation from my body, from my being. And I noticed that other people I'd met over the course of my life often did not have that kind of alienation, the sense of being baffled by who one actually is. So I can relate to those. I hadn't been aware of that David Foster Wallace quote because I've never actually gotten very far in any of his books, but I do recall the Don DeLillo line.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think I've had just a life of being baffled by my own existence and not understanding how other people are not essentially disabled by that kind of sense of not really knowing who they are.
they're probably not disabled as an innate survival mechanism, because if we were aware of reality with a capital R, we probably wouldn't be able to get through the day, much less the morning. But where do you think that stems from? That sense of abstraction, bodily abstraction that you have.
Um, I think a lot of it was, or some of it was gender dysphoria, that I always felt that I was in the wrong body to begin with. So what's the point? You know? And of course, when I was a kid, there was no discussion that I was aware of transgenderism. And when I was in high school, I came across a book by oh, by a woman who was one of the early transgender success stories. She had been a man named James Morris, who was essentially a literary travel writer. But then she wrote this book called Conundrum, which was about her experience at, changing gender. And of course, in those years, it was called sex change operations, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So that was in the 1970s when I was in high school when I came across that. And of course, there was no discussion of that anywhere else. So um, I just figured, I'm in the wrong body. There's really nothing I can do about it. I've got to just resign myself to where I am. So yeah, there was always a despair, but it wasn't only the gender thing. It's just that I never felt as if I belonged in the world. I just didn't have
Mhm.
a foothold, any sense of having a footing in the world. Everything just seemed strange to me. Uh, Things didn't make sense to me. In fact, at some point, it was in the eighth grade. I really had a transformative experience in the eighth grade, but I don't think I explicitly mentioned this in the book. Maybe I do, but I just can't remember it. But I had always been an indifferent student up until that point. Not a terrible student, but essentially a C student. And about halfway through eighth grade, when I also learned that I needed glasses, because I didn't know that I needed glasses, I didn't know that the words that the teacher was writing on the board were supposed to be legible to me where I was sitting. So I remember being called out of everybody was called out of class for an eye exam. And the nurse who examined me, when she saw that I couldn't read the letters, she said, what is wrong? You should have had glasses a long time ago. So
Mhm.
I got glasses. But then the other thing that happened in eighth grade was that I thought I got to change or I'm gonna be a total failure in life. So I started imitating other people and just doing things that they did. And also in terms of my homework assignments, for example, the books that we had to read in the English class, I would just read them over and over and over, even though I felt I wasn't understanding them. I think I do mention in the book about Animal Farm. We had to read Animal Farm. And I
Mhm.
kept rereading that, and it made absolutely no sense. It made absolutely no sense to me at all. I um, I just don't understand. And it's not that, I mean, we learned in class that it was an allegory, but even that didn't make any sense to me. So I realized that if I'm going to succeed in even getting through the end of eighth grade, I'm just going to have to start memorizing stuff
Mhm.
without necessarily understanding it, or else I'm gonna fail. So, um, so in terms of my mental activity, in terms of my emotional activity, I was just out of step with everything else.
Do you think that the autism diagnosis plays a part? You parenthetically mentioned that you had an autism diagnosis in your late 50s, sometime near the end of the book. This is mentioned. Do you think that has something to do with what you were saying?
Oh yeah, I think it has almost everything to do with it because, um, and I did when I started reading about autism, I saw that uh, a larger percentage of autistic people have gender dysphoria than in any other group of people. But yeah, what happened to me when I was in my 50s, there started being lots of articles about Asperger's syndrome. And I would see these articles like in the New York Times, and there would be anecdotal accounts of people who always knew there was something wrong with them or slightly wrong with them, but they could never figure it out. And then they got the Asperger's syndrome diagnosis, and everything fell into place. So I read a lot of stories like that. What those stories often left out is that after I guess the liberating sense of learning how one is different, then there eventually descends upon the person a sense that, well, now that I know this, but I'm still totally out of step with everybody else. So what am I supposed to do now?
Mhm.
So yeah, so I did pursue that diagnosis because I thought that that could explain lots of things about me, such as my my verbal problems and also my sense of being very restricted in what I can do, the repetitive nature of of my life. For example, I think I mentioned in the book that there were certain movies that I would just watch over and over and over again,
Mhm.
such as Wendy and Lucy, which I'd seen well over 100 times, maybe closer to 150 times. I mean, there was a point when I would just come home at the end of a day and just watch that movie almost as a kind of meditation, because it's a very quiet movie, very little dialogue in it. And, I would encounter other people who maybe have seen a particular movie, 3 or 4 times, but not like over 100 times. What is going on there? Well, as it turns out, that is very, very common among autistic people to do something repetitively, like listen to the same song over and over and over again. So a lot of the weirdnesses about my life, as it turns out, are not uncommon among other autistic people, such as the fact that I've lived almost my entire life without any furniture. I like to be on the floor. Well, I did encounter on this big autism site, it's called Wrong Planet, that quite a number of autistic people like to be on the floor at all times. They don't like to be on furniture. They feel, I don't know, they feel more at ease on the floor. I mean, I'm on the floor right now as we're having this conversation. So, yeah, I think the autism diagnosis in my late 50s was helpful in simply understanding myself, and also enabling me to give up on trying to do things that I just can't do. I mean, there are many even simple things about life. I can't whistle. I can't snap my fingers. There's many things I can't do, but I no longer criticize myself for not being able to do those things. I just try to accept myself or my limitations as they are.
Would you trade it all in? Trade the beautiful writing and all your fiction accomplishments? Would you trade that in to live a quote unquote normalized life?
Well, that's a difficult question. Probably not, because I mean, obviously there were many writers, like we talked about John Updike. He was obviously not screwed up in any major way. But I think that my writing does arise from my being an outsider, being a misfit, being a weirdo, or whatever, and that if I were not that person, I would not have written the things that I've written. In fact, one of the things that, I took those Gordon Lish workshops, or it can't really be called workshop. They were just lectures for several summers. And and even though most of it was way over my head, one thing that really made sense to me was that he said, everybody is screwed up in his or her own way.
Yes.
And what you have to do is recognize exactly what it is that differentiates yourself from everybody else, and then dilate that, expand it, and that's your material. And that has definitely worked for me, because I realize, again, all my writing arises from my lack of an ordinary existence, or an ordinary personality, or whatever. So yeah, that was very freeing.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
So overall, after 50 years, give or take, what brought you to, amass this collection and finally bring it out? Did it come from a sense of mortality, or was there something else that urged you?
Well, there were two things, and one was the sense of mortality, because I'm almost 70 at this point, and I was, in my late 60s when I started working on this. And I think about death all the time. As a matter of fact, a favorite writer of mine, Anna DeForest, in their second novel, has, the narrator says, or is quoting some Buddhist statement along the lines of, if you've gone through the entire morning without thinking about death, you wasted the morning. So I think as one gets older, death is at the forefront of one's mind. So that was the first thing. But the second thing was the pandemic. And the fact that I retired right after the pandemic began. And because the pandemic isolated my life even further, because I could not do the sorts of things I was accustomed to doing, such as going into Pittsburgh very frequently and walking the streets, that sort of thing. I no longer felt safe doing that, because this was before the vaccines. So I was just going through a lot of stuff in my apartment. And when I had moved into this apartment 25 years ago, I had brought the boxes containing all those typewritten pages, but they were in sealed boxes, heavily sealed boxes, because the previous apartment had lots of cockroaches. The building was just completely infested. So I sealed the boxes before I moved, and that was 25 years before I started on this project. And I decided to open up and see what was exactly in them. And I found so much stuff. I found, for example, so many drafts of stories from my first book, Stories in the Worst Way, and so much material that I had cut from the stories. So my first project during the the pandemic, during the early year or so, the first year or so of the pandemic I thought, I got to figure out what to do with this stuff because as I was reading through the material that I had cut, I wondered, why did I cut this stuff? Because I like it now. I must have hated it at the time. So my first project resulted in a book called Worsted.
Mm,
Uh, and quite a number of the stories in that book consist of sentences that I had crossed out or, excised from stories in the worst way. So there are some stories in the Worsted book that are almost like shadow stories of earlier stories, because I was just able to take all those sentences I'd cut out and arrange them into a story unto themselves,
mm,
unto itself. So that was my first big project because I was just struck by how much material there was. I mean, I'm talking
mm,
about thousands and thousands of pages. So then after I finished that project, that's when I realized that I've got all these notebook type entries. So I started typing up excerpts. And again, I'm the backwardness book is simply excerpts because a lot of the stuff I thought it would not be worth including. And that's when those two old friends of mine told me about the fact that they had held on to my letters and they sent them to me. So then I spent a lot of time just typing up excerpts from those letters. And again, these are these excerpts. For example, I remember one letter was 32 typed single space pages long. And it was not written at one time. It was written over the course of a week in graduate school. And from those 32 pages, I don't think I pulled more than maybe like 4 or 5 sentences because all the other stuff, I mean, a lot of these letters, especially my other friend, Tom Batsko, they were letters about how I did on my exams or what grades I got on papers and a lot of class stuff and class related stuff. And of course, that has no interest even to me anymore. But
mm,
it was all the other stuff in those letters that I extracted. And when I mentioned, most of the letters were I wrote to a friend called named Keith Jones rather. We sort of had our own private language, and obviously that would be lost on any kind of reader, and it would not even be of interest to any other reader. So I really again typed up only a little bit of what was in those letters. Now the notebooks, the things that I typed on my own, I think that overall those were much more accessible. But even with those, I typed up only excerpts.
mm. There's a significant amount of what I would call people watching as a pastime in backwardness. Can you talk about any kind of enjoyment or pleasure you get from watching other people? Because that's a pastime that I've enjoyed back in the day. Usually, I don't get out much these days, but in college, say, just watching people.
Yeah, that's always been a fascination of mine because again, I would always wonder, what makes these people tick? What are they doing? Why are they doing it? So, and I'm especially, I guess I especially notice creepy people or weirdos, odd people, strange people, and since I go to Pittsburgh a lot, although I had to stop during the pandemic, I just walk the streets and I do observe people, and I see a great deal of strangeness, and occasionally I'm approached by by weirdos. For example, one time I was waiting for uh, one of Pittsburgh has a little subway system, and I was waiting for a train in one of the stations. Not that I had anywhere to go; I was just going to take the train to the end of the line and then just turn around and come back. But this guy comes up to me, and I was staring at a subway map on the wall, and he must have thought that I needed directions or something. So he said, "Where are you going?" And we got in this strange conversation. He was asking me the weirdest questions. Like one question was, "Do you read at the library?" And I said, "No." And then he said, "Oh, you take the books home?" And I said, "Yeah." And then he said, Where were you before here? Before you were here? New York?" And I said, "No, I'm from Allentown. It's the other end of the state." And then, oh yeah, he said, "Yeah, I was gonna go to Allentown to be paid to learn how to repair jewelry." And then this subway maintenance man comes by, like a guy with a sweeper or something. And this guy says to the sweeper or the maintenance man, "They ever they ever bring you drinks?" And they can, and the maintenance man muttered something which I didn't hear. And then we got on the train. I didn't sit anywhere near him, uh, but this guy comes at a later stop. He gets on board with a walker, And so the guy, I should give him a name, that the weird guy says, ever drive your wife's car? What a weird thing. So, I mean, I encounter stuff like this, and I start writing down some of it because it is so peculiar. I mean, I made sure right after that encounter with that one guy that I took out my phone and
Mhm.
tried to remember as much as I could because he asked me a lot of questions. For example, I remember he said, "Where are you going?" So I said, "The north side." Then he said, "Casino?" Because there's a casino over there. And I
Mhm.
said, "No." I said, "I've got an appointment." And then he said, "Mercy?" Well, it turns out Mercy is a mental hospital on the north side. So the whole thing was just absolutely nuts. And the thing is, I don't know if I should have just walked away from him, but he didn't seem dangerous. He just seemed really odd. And again, I guess somehow, well, when I was in graduate school, somebody said of me that I'm a freak magnet. And
Mhm.
it is true. I mean, there are things in the book. For example, I was sitting, things that happened to me when I was sitting on, taking buses from Ohio back to Allentown. People would sit down next to me and just start talking to me and saying weird things. Um, so yeah, I think if you live alone, as I do, if you live a very isolated life, your few encounters with other people are at checkout counters at supermarkets or
Mhm.
at the counter at fast food restaurants. And if something goes even mildly wrong with any of those encounters, it kind of gets magnified in your brain for the rest of the day. And you
Mhm.
begin to question, what is it about myself that elicited this kind of reaction from,
Would you say you seek out these encounters? I mean, the more you are in public, the more you're susceptible to them.
yeah, I
Mhm.
don't seek them out, but yeah, I do realize I am susceptible because I need to get out. I don't like to be at home. I like to be, I like to be walking around the city.
Mhm.
And you do run the risk of being accosted by people, and
Mhm.
especially right now. I mean, there's a lot of beggars, panhandlers, even the
Yeah.
very aggressive panhandlers out there. So, in fact, there's one guy who, and I mentioned him in the book. He always says the same thing: "Do you have 50 cents or a dollar? Do you have 50 cents or a dollar?" That's his line, and I see him every time I go to Pittsburgh. So that's obviously his occupation. He's a
Mhm.
profession. Okay?
I relate to what you're saying about sort of magnifying these little interactions into something more. I think it might be a combination of, say, social anxiety and the autism. I have some sort of high functioning version of autism. Those interactions can be a source of amusement, and I admire that you've turned them into art.
It was just a matter of by writing them down, I thought I was somehow coming to terms with them and taking some of the almost malignant quality of them because I mean these things would really disturb me. I mean, I would tell myself, why is this happening to me and not the other person who was walking very close to me? Uh, it's just
It's almost as much of a diary of you as it is about of other people because you quote so much from other people, oftentimes not even commenting on it. You let the words speak for themselves.
oh yeah, yeah.
And I've also noticed that there is uh, quite a lot of descriptions of people's handwriting uh, in this book and in your fiction. Are you of the mind that handwriting kind of reveals personality or some deeper things? Are you a proponent of graphology, as it were? Or can you comment on that?
Yeah, I don't think I am. I think that the reason why I'm kind of fascinated by other people's handwriting is that, in contrast, it makes my own handwriting, look fake or suspect or something, as if it's not genuine.
Mhm.
And I mean, I remember one time I had to go pick up something I had ordered online at a Home Depot type store. And when I approached the counter, I gave the number of the order, and the young woman wrote those numbers down on a sheet of paper that I still have somewhere. That is so beautiful that it looks like calligraphy. And she just wrote it down really, really fast. The numbers were large and so beautifully formed. And I realized my own handwriting is so deformed in contrast. So that's the only thing about other people's handwriting. I'm fascinated with it because it's often so beautiful, so consistent, so uniform, and beautifully peculiar. So, I mean, all it would suggest to me is that somehow they are in a more they have a more orderly mind, or better coordination when they're holding a pen or something. But no, I never thought in terms of any kind of specific personality marker.
Yes, I mean, yeah, I don't believe in graphology, but I do think there is something in handwriting with any given person, and it also seems to be something of a lost art, or an art that we are losing.
Oh yeah, in
What?
fact, I've heard talk radio discussions about how cursive handwriting is not being taught in the schools, and therefore, how are kids going to know how to sign their name on a check, or how will they be able to understand cursive handwriting when they encounter it? Even though there are fewer and fewer
Mm. Well,
instances of
they
that.
would ask you, "What's a check?"
Yeah, oh, but that's true too. Because I mean, I still write checks, and I've read that um, it's like a baby. I don't even technically I'm a baby boomer, but I consider myself part of Generation Jones, which is the tail end of baby boomers who don't have the kind of qualities that you associate with baby boomers. Well, baby boomers, because I I I don't dress like a baby boomer. I don't listen to who's that guy? Oh, Jimmy Buffett. And I was really struck by an article in the New Yorker a year or so ago that people tend to associate, for example, Bob Dylan with the baby boomer generation, but he wasn't a baby boomer. He was the generation before that.
Mm.
So this writer, I think it was Louis Manand in the New Yorker, he said the yuppie syndrome is a baby boomer syndrome. So anyway, um, thing is, getting back to handwriting, I feel that the elegant handwriting of, oh, now what I was going to say was that I'm often struck when I see for the first time the handwriting of somebody I've gotten to know. And I'm sometimes shocked that their handwriting is so different from what I would have expected
Mm.
their handwriting to be like. So it's something of a, it's kind of disconcerting sometimes.
A memory just came to me of I've been self-conscious of my handwriting. It's terrible, and I remember now as a kid, I would say if I was writing a short note to a girl I liked, or maybe a birthday card for somebody, I would ask my mother to write it because her handwriting was far better. I don't know, that just came to me, but we can talk about mothers later on.
Well,
Uh,
I understand entirely because somewhere along the line, oh, maybe I read this somewhere. Maybe it was in a short story that somebody wrote about somebody else asking somebody to rewrite in their own penmanship a love letter.
mm,
I can't remember where I saw that, and I think one of the reasons why I started typing early on because I love typewriters, and unfortunately, I no longer have one because the last one I had, which was a really good one, got damaged when my apartment was flooded by a hot water tank bursting.
oh
But
gosh.
people would ask me, why are your letters typed? Was two things really, that I could type faster than I could write, but also my writing was not very very good at all.
Mm. Did you read the piece in The Nation that recently came out about you and your work?
Yeah, I did.
What did you think of it?
Well, I was pleased that that the book got some attention because it really was, other than a paragraph in the art forum online, not in the print version art forum. This this review in the Nation was the only attention the book got. Now there has since been one other review, but it's always weird to read a review of your, or at least I find it always very weird to read a review of your own work. And I mean, I'm glad that the guy liked the book a lot. Uh, and it's just that, again, when you read somebody writing about your own work, what is written often doesn't align with your own sense of what you had written.
Mhm.
And so I don't know, but yeah, I was pleased to get.
Especially with a book of this nature. In another podcast I listened to, in which you appear as a guest, you mentioned that you're not someone who divulges much personal information. And yet here we are with an almost 1,000 page tome that lets it all hang out.
Yeah, the big difference though is that very few people are going to ever read this book, and so it's not as if somebody asked me on the street, I don't know, just any kind of personal question. In that kind of context, I would be very reluctant to disclose anything.
So if you thought this would become a bestseller, for instance, you wouldn't have published it?
Well, I knew it was not. I mean, nothing I write is ever going to attract more than a small group of readers. And I used to think, I mean, when I came to that conclusion about my writing, I mean, this was like back in the 1990s, I would think of that Emily Dickinson line, the soul selects her own society, or the soul selects her own society and then shuts the door, something like that. And I feel as if I haven't risked much by writing this book, because again, how many people will ever encounter this?
There's no way to know for sure. I mean, even in the Nation piece, I had forgotten that your name was being whispered about as far as being a contender for the Nobel Prize. I vaguely remember this. This was before I had started reading your work. Can you comment on that? And I mean, if you had won the Nobel Prize, then almost everyone would be reading who reads Backwardness.
Well, that whole Nobel Prize thing, I thought that was some kind of a joke, that somebody was obviously betting on me or at Ladbrokes as a kind of, who knows, for some kind of perverse reason or another. So then I had to learn how nominations are actually handled. And the Nobel Committee doesn't reveal nominations until 50 years after or 50 years later. So there's no evidence whatsoever that I was ever under consideration for that prize. And I really do think that this was some kind of sick joke. But I mean, that's as much as I can make of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to begin with, I've written very little. And again, it's just very obscure stuff. So again, that was actually an uncomfortable thing for me when that happened, because I even saw, because I was Googling about this, and there were suggestions that I was the source of this. And that
what?
really humiliates me, because I don't even have a website. I don't do anything really to publicize my writing. So that really stunned me. And then,
Mm-hmm. I mean, the internet, the farther you dig into the internet, the more idiocy you find, like stuff like that. So
yeah. And then there's even this online bulletin board about the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Literature Prize, where, I mean, people are really, really, really serious about who they think should get it. And when somebody mentioned my work, my writing, this guy actually went to the trouble of getting access to the whatever library the Nobel program has, and said, there are no books by this person in that library. So they would not even be aware that this person exists. I mean, that's the extent to which people were essentially trying to say this whole thing about this person being coming up in these lists, that this is totally fraudulent. So yeah, it was upsetting to me, because I'm not a person who's looking for attention.
yeah.
So how this came about, I don't know.
All I'll say is, had you won the prize, it would give me more faith in the prize and in the literati, so to say. But quoting from the Nation piece one last time, it says, if there really is a loneliness epidemic in America, backwardness may one day emerge as its signal text. Do you think there is a loneliness epidemic in this country?
Yeah, because I read a lot about that. I mean, I don't seek out these articles, but in newspapers and magazines, this often comes up. And one of the big problems is the correlation between loneliness and various different types of physical ailments and premature or early death. And I think in Britain, there's even an official who's been appointed to deal with the loneliness crisis. And I mean, the pandemic obviously made things even worse. But what I find especially when I'm encountering people from Generation Z, that if they're checking me out at, if I'm in the supermarket and they're the checkout person, there will be no eye contact whatsoever. And I do see among an increasing number of people expressionless faces in public, and the face always aimed toward the phone, which is in one's hand. Because as I walk around and because I am walking around so much, I'm constantly being almost bumped into by people looking at their phones because they haven't been disabused of the notion that the human brain is capable of multitasking. In fact, when I used to teach, one of the first essays that I assigned was a sequence of short readings on uh, the neurological perspective on multitasking, namely that the human brain can really focus on only one task at a time, and the people who think they're multitasking are doing what they call task switching. So for a fraction of a second, they're doing one thing, then a fraction of a second, doing something else, but they're not doing both simultaneously. And for some reason, the human brain can't do that. So
Mm.
I think with this preoccupation with phones, that it's further isolating people from the civilities of interaction among strangers.
Mhm.
Because often when these people almost bump into me, they almost never say oops or sorry. Even among people of middle age, I see less and less courtesy in public, and often, or I should say sometimes, the person who almost bumped into me will look at me as if I'm the person who's causing the trouble. So yeah, it's gotten really weird out there, and there definitely is a loneliness epidemic. For example, in some of these articles, it often mentions that there are these surveys asking people, do you have somebody, or how many people can you turn to when you're in an emotional crisis? And there's quite a number of people, quite a percentage of people who don't have a single person. Or if they do have a person, it's going to be just one person. So
Mhm.
the kind of, this started, I don't know when that book called Bowling Alone came out. This was, I don't know if in the 1990s or whatever. It was a book by some sociologist, I think, who was investigating the extent to which many Americans no longer are absorbed in their community and no longer, go to church, or they're not in bowling leagues, or they don't go out with people in groups. And it's an atomized society. Now, I don't think that my book is not necessarily emblematic of that because it's just too weird. Obviously there are a lot of weirdos, but they're going to be weird in their own ways.
Mhm.
So yeah, I don't think how this could possibly be a loneliness epidemic book, because people have been lonely like this, the way I'm writing about, all along.
Mhm.
Go back to Bartleby.
Back to who?
Bartleby the Scrivener.
Oh, yes.
I mean, there have always been isolados.
So another chief element of your book is filled with sweets, sweets and soda. I would like to invite you to read a small section that can highlight this, starting at page 354.
Okay, this this little segment arose from the fact that a friend wrote me a letter. It wasn't one of the two people whose letters that I wrote to them are included in the book, because I wasn't able to get access to this person's letters. But he once wrote me a letter that was simply a series of quotations from letters of mine. He just assembled or compiled references to things that I had eaten, and he put them together into this paragraph. So it says, from a letter from a friend. Your file is at hand. I've been combing through your missives for references to food. My highlighter at the ready. Colon. So these are the quotations from my letters. A Murphy Mart hamburger platter that turned out to be the apex of my week. Now heating half a grease bucket's worth of Weaver chicken strips in the toaster oven. The burger and fries were no portal to a better world. The cookie was dreadful, powdery. A large Calamity Howard's order of waffle fries. So I wound up buying some more squeezy nuggets to go. I drove to Long John Silver's, stupid move, for a chicken plank dinner. An oil-bearing sausage biscuit. 5 of those hopes up sturdiest, oversized Nestle bars, and another carton of animal crackers. I wanted some of those bicuspid crackling Lynette crispy peanut butter eggs. I thought I'd go out in search of the Nabisco famous chocolate wafers again. With this new supply of Coke, I'll drink myself into a bloated, white-pissed, quasi-diabetic stupor. That can of Libby's fruit cocktail I opened about 3 weeks ago, and about which I remained passionless. A jumbo Pepsi to tide me over. I ate 20 Kentucky Fried Chicken nuggets and a pint of their mashed potatoes and am now prostrate with cramps. I had the brown whoopie cake for dessert. It was to die from.
I love that to die from, that sort of topsy-turvy of the phrase to die for. Just one example of many of why I love your work, but if you'll forgive me for asking, how are you still alive with a diet like this?
That's a really good question because, I'm going to turn 70 years old now, and I finally am suffering from the kind of eating I did most of my life.
It's catching up with you?
It's caught up with me in really disturbing ways. Yeah. The thing is, and this sort of goes back to autism, that autistic people often have a very limited array of foods that they find edible.
Mm.
And it just so happens that the things that I find edible are the things that could not possibly be worse, any more worse for me.
Mm.
Hamburgers, French fries. I mean, in that Nation review, the guy said that I was eating at Burger King for lunch almost every day for 20 years. I think it was actually longer than that. And
Oh, well.
I've cut back to visiting Burger King only twice a week now. And it's just that there's this one particular Burger King, because at Burger King as a whole, I don't like their food is often sloppy, but this one Burger King is so wonderful that it's a paradise for me. But yeah, I mean, when I was an undergraduate, my breakfast would be M&Ms and Coke. And all I essentially did was eat fast food, junk food, chocolate. I remember reading somewhere a long time ago, decades ago, where Andy Warhol was invited to some wealthy patron's home on the Upper East Side. And when dinner was served, the hostess said to Warhol, "Well, why aren't you touching your food?" And he said, "Oh, I only eat candy." And
Mm.
that was sort of like me. I mean, even at work, I would often have a pound bag of peanut butter M&Ms in a drawer, and I would often go through a whole pound in one day. And
Mm.
I wasn't aware that someday this was really going to mess me up.
Mm.
And I'm at that point, but I don't regret the diet because I definitely enjoyed the food.
That's the difference that makes all the difference. I mean, I could eat like that. I have eaten like that. Um, Ironically enough, starting January 1st, I cut out sugar and overeating, and then I was reading your book. So I was sort of vacillating between being tempted by all these sweets and goodies, but also being disgusted by getting the sort of vicarious stomach cramps, hearing about all this, reading about it. So,
It's true that I did get cramps along the way, but I just figured that, okay, that's okay. That'll pass.
mm. Do you think you're a super sensor, that maybe that's part of the autism? Because my wife, she hadn't eaten anything green until college, and she is a super sensor. She's very aware of textures with food and smells and things of that nature.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I don't think I ate my first salad until I was in grad school, and that was just a
Mm.
lone salad that was sort of forced upon me. And
Mm.
I didn't eat fish um, until I spent a semester at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas, maybe like, I don't know, 15 years ago. And a professor, a fiction writer on the faculty, invited me to dinner, and turns out he served salmon, and I hadn't eaten any fish since maybe like age 5 or 6. But I forced myself to eat it, and luckily, it didn't really taste like anything. Because when I saw it, I thought, "How am I going to get that inside of myself?"
Mm.
Yeah, I did. So, yeah, I have a lot of limitations as
I mean, seafood is it's something.
something. You
Uh,
mean something good?
no,
Oh,
I myself, my wife and I, we've been vegan for almost 10 years now. So, but even when my wife was not vegan, she was disgusted by seafood, and even though I ate seafood, I could still see why people would hate it, just the smell alone.
oh
Uh,
yeah. Because actually, there's a big fish market in Pittsburgh that I often walk through, and
mm,
they have the live lobsters and all kinds of dead fish of all sorts. And yeah, the stink of it is just disgusting. But
yeah.
just that this particular, I mean, as a consequence of the pandemic, there were fewer and fewer public accessible restrooms.
Mhm.
And if you're walking for hours, eventually you might have to go to the restroom. And this fish market has some restrooms downstairs. So that's why I go in that fish market a lot. But
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I can't imagine how people eat lobsters. I, I just, it's not unfathomable to me. But then how can I eat the stuff that I do eat? I mean, it's all pretty disgusting.
Mm. So you go into depth and at length about strangers and strange interactions, about your diet, about relationships with friends, family, uh, spouses, etc. But the huge absence in this nearly 1,000-page book was what I would call the writer's life and talk of the art of the craft. There are some mentions in passing for the most part, but overall, it's not there. You mentioned your first book coming out very offhandedly, and then later you mentioned how you were tracked down by an ostensible fan via a chat forum. I think he was grilling you a little bit or something like that. And
Yeah.
then later on, you mentioned how an apartment technician bought two of your author copies that were in your home and left you a note saying, "Oh, I saw that you're an author and I left you $20 or something like that." But other than these instances, there's this absence. And I wonder if it's because you don't think of yourself as a writer. In our text interview some years back, you said, "I don't even think of myself as a writer. I think of myself more as a kind of compositor, a typesetter, a handler and arranger of words. They've got bulk, they've got their volumes and hollows, their crustifications and iridescences, and I just fit them into compositure. I'm pretty literal about things."
Well, yeah, it's true. I don't think of myself as a writer because when I think of writers, I think of people who are ambitious people who are pursuing a career.
Mm,
And they would be teaching in an MFA program. They would have a website. They would do lots of personal appearances. And they would make sure that their name gets out there. And I never felt that way at all. In fact, I often feel ashamed about my writing. And I I guess the only time that I probably feel like a writer is when I'm actually writing. In fact,
mm,
because since I finished Backwardness, I wrote almost nothing until about 3 days ago when I started writing a story. And definitely while writing the story, I felt like a writer because I actually was writing. But for the past year, after finishing, or however, I'm sure it was longer. It was well longer than a year ago when I finished Backwardness because it's almost been out for a year now. So all that time, I don't have any identity as a writer whatsoever. For example, I live in an apartment building. Nobody here would know that I've ever written anything or anything about me altogether, or even like the doctor that I go to, my dentist, and they don't know that I'm a writer. It just never comes up.
Despite that, though, I would imagine that, say, you would confide in someone and talk about the struggle of coming together, getting this collection together, say your first collection, Stories in the Worst Way, or something.
Oh, I mean, I did have a few acquaintances who were also engaged in writing, but these would be long distance people. Uh,
Mhm.
and yeah, to them, I mean, I don't ever think I said to them I'm a writer, but I said, yeah, I'm working on this collection. Yeah, but other than that, I mean, I don't have discussions. I mean, I've had very very few discussions in my life about writing.
Mhm.
Um, Whereas I know that people I've encountered have made it known that they often exchange work with other writers and spend a lot of time with each other's work. And I was never really in a situation like that,
Mhm.
uh, except until recently when I have made a few friends recently in the past few years, and occasionally they'll show me stuff of theirs, and I'll show stuff of mine. But it's usually in relation to getting published. That the person is an editor somewhere and wants to see something that I've written. But other than that, I mean, my activities do not include much of anything
Mhm.
what you would think a writer would be involved with.
At the very least, I was hoping that there would be something about the workshops or lectures that you took with Gordon Lish, which I wouldn't have known about had I not heard you talking about that in another podcast. So, are there any correspondence about this that you didn't include, or about writing in general, or is this just something, like you said, you don't really talk about?
I do have a lot of postcards from Gordon Lish because that's primarily the way he communicates with people.
Mhm.
He gives these postcards, but I don't think, and there must be hundreds of them, or at least 100 of them, and they almost never have anything to do with actual writing. They're just
Mhm.
things about life, and I don't. I guess there must have been some point along the way when I thought that I would benefit from being in communication with other writers about the specific things that I'm working on. But generally, even when uh, my books have come out, only rarely were they edited. I mean, with my first book, Gordon Lish took me on as a writer when he was still working at Knopf, but he was fired soon after that. So I think only like maybe 5 or 6 stories in the book were actually edited by him. I tried to, I guess, internalize what I had learned about his editing methods. And my second book didn't have any editing whatsoever. The next two had a little bit of editing, some questions that people had raised about a particular word or particular sentence. But I've never undergone extensive editing, and I would have liked that. I'm sure I would have
Mhm.
benefited from that. But um, well, even with my collected stories book, it was originally going to be there was a big five publisher that was going to publish it, but I backed out. But the um, the editor had said, "I'm not going to edit this," and that's a weird thing to hear. I'm not going to edit this. Um,
Line editing seems like a lost art as well.
yeah, the thing is, Lish was a genius at line editing, and
Mhm.
that's why, from the few stories of mine that he did edit, I'm really grateful for.
There's a section in Backwardness in which you talk about the movies that have meant something to you. I did read the excerpt that appeared in an X-Ray magazine, and you include, among other things, Taxi Driver, which of Taxi Driver, you said from the start everything about that movie. Its hallucinational neonscape, the nicotine saxophonery of the soundtrack, Travis Bickle's shatter-brained honest Johnism, his paranoid charm seemed piped directly into all the tubes and ducts and back channels of my neurodivergency and into all of my disaffection as a morbidly alienated hick college isolado with shit for brains. I never once took my eyes off the screen, even though the running time was a longsome 1 hour and 54 minutes. And you also mentioned blue is the warmest color. What are some movies you've seen recently that you've taken this much of a liking to?
Well, actually, lately, I haven't gotten obsessed with any particular movies, even though I subscribe to the Criterion streaming service and also the movie. I don't know, I guess that's how you pronounce it, movie streaming service. And uh, in the past, I would get obsessed with a movie and watch it over and over and over. I'd go out and buy the DVD, that sort of thing. But I haven't had that kind of reaction. I mean, I'm a big Michelle Williams fan, and I thought I would become obsessed with her most recent movie by the director who made Wendy and Lucy, a movie called Showing Up. But I watched it and I felt almost completely indifferent to it. I
Mhm.
mean, lately, well, a few months ago, Criterion had a bunch of Mike Leigh movies, and I watched one I had never seen before. It was called uh, Bleak Moments, and I guess it was his very first movie, and I loved it. It was a movie in which every character was a misfit in one way or another. I really loved it, but I thought as I was watching it, oh, I'm going to be watching this one a lot of times, but I never went back and rewatched it. And I saw something on Mubi called uh, Aka, Ayka, and I really got caught up in that movie. It was about a young woman in Russia who gives birth but abandons the baby at the hospital, and she was struggling to get by. I loved that movie, but again, I didn't watch it a second time. But those were the ones that stuck out a lot. And it was something else I saw on Mubi. It was a short feature called Two Ships. It was just simply about a man and a woman, a young man and a young woman who randomly meet at a party in, not exactly sure where,
Mhm.
I think in Brussels somewhere. And I got caught up in that. That one I did watch 3 times, but it was only 30 minutes long. But other than that, I just well,
I'll check those out. I do have a 3-month trial. to movie, and some maybe. Have you seen The Girl with the Needle?
No. Is that on movie?
Yes, that's a newer one that came out in the past couple months. You might enjoy that one. Another one is Close Your Eyes.
I don't know that one either.
It's I forget the name of the director, but it's his first new film in 31 years, and I thought it was fairly phenomenal, to say the least. So
Well,
see if those stick with you or strike out. Or
yeah. It just struck me that a week or so ago, I did rewatch something, a movie that I had seen months and months ago. It was a documentary about that street photographer who'd been a nanny in Chicago, and I'm forgetting her pronunciation of her last name, but it was Vivian Meyer or Mayer,
Mhm.
and she was this real outsider who took like 150,000 photographs on the street without ever showing them to anybody, and they were discovered after her death, the negatives, etc. So I love that because she was just such an outsider artist, and I kind of was drawn into her life and her lonelyhood and the fact that she was trying to express herself through these photographs.
Mhm. Have you kept up with Paul Schrader's work at all since Taxi Driver?
I've seen a number of his movies. I haven't seen his most recent one. It's funny that when I saw the one with Ethan Hawke as a priest or a minister or something, um, so I was watching and I thought, this is going to have a Taxi Driver like ending. And it did sort of.
Yes.
I think that's the only. I'm trying to remember if I.
His God's Lonely Man trilogy includes that one, First Reformed, Master Gardener, and The Card Counter.
Oh, I haven't seen Master Gardener, and the what was that last one again? The card.
The Card Counter.
I haven't seen that one. I did see the one about a father whose daughter gets caught up in prostitution, or
Oh,
I forget what that's called. Wasn't that Paul Schrader?
Hardcore, I believe it's.
Oh yeah, wasn't that Paul Schrader?
Yes, it was. I think you'd like the rest of the God's Lonely Man trilogy. I actually went to the premiere of Schrader's latest film, Oh Canada, and I tracked him down like Travis Bickle and got his signature on my Master Gardener poster.
Oh,
But yeah, that trilogy I think is one of the best things he's made, and it does sort of build on the kind of taxi driver, lonely man with a diary, and I guess that connects to backwardness. Did you feel some connection with at least the diaretical, if that's even a word, diaretical aspects of these films, First
oh yeah,
Reformed and
oh yeah.
Taxi Driver?
In fact, yeah. Generally, I like movies that don't have a lot of plot. Taxi Driver does have quite a bit of plot, but
Mm.
yeah. I mean, as a teenager, when I saw that, or I don't know if it was 20 or 19 or 20 when I saw that the first time, it was almost disturbing how much I identified with Travis Bickle.
I think even Paul Schrader said that there are a lot of Travis Bickles now more than ever.
Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah.
But to move on, one of the sort of, I would say, the most emotionally dense parts of backwardness is your relationship with your mother, particularly near the end of her life when you were taking care of her and visiting her, but also you maintained a relationship with her until the very end, despite being on the receiving end of insults from her. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship to give people an idea who haven't read the book?
Yeah, I remember when I was in grad school, which was the first time in my life when I ever got involved in long conversations with people and actually learned how to participate in the conversation. When I would talk about my mother and her behavior toward me, one person in particular said, "Look, you need to sever complete tie. You need to completely sever ties with your mother. You cannot continue with this. You're doing yourself damage by doing this." But I did experimentally sever my ties with my mother a few times in my life, but they generally didn't last longer than a few months. And I mean, my mother was very insulting. For example, at Christmas time, when I would give her the presents that I bought, and one time I even tape recorded her comments when opening presents. She would insult everything.
Mhm.
What is with this crap? Well, what do you can take this back? What do you you know? So this, and I do have this on tape somewhere. I can't. I haven't been able to find a tape, but it's on a cassette somewhere. So no matter what kind of thing whatever I got interested in, she would demean me for being interested in that sort of thing. So yeah, it was a lifelong pattern of insults. But then uh, somebody once Somebody with whom I discussed this a lot said, it sounds as if the only way your mother can achieve emotional intimacy with somebody is by insulting them. Because, I mean, she insulted everybody, neighbors, other family members, etc. And that struck me as making a lot of sense. And the thing is, even though I did have those few, probably no more than 2 brief separations from my mother, I was always drawn back because one gets only one mother, one biological mother. And this is the person who brought you into the world. And especially when I think of when my mother, ended up in assisted living for the final years of her life, that I was simply repaying to her what she had done for me when I was a young kid, not even verbal at all in any way yet. And she was taking care of me. So
Mhm.
I felt that I was reciprocating somehow. And because I would visit her at the assisted living place almost every single night, I would usually take one day off a week to make sure, one Saturday off a week, so I could, one Saturday off a month rather, to go to Pittsburgh to walk around. But what struck me, because I was in the assisted living place so often visiting her, very few people had visitors, at least during the time that I was there. And I would think, here these people are, they've been sort of abandoned in this assisted living place. And it was very, very sad. So, and also I had to uproot her from Allentown and move her out here. And I felt really bad about that because she had lived in the area all her life. And now she's in this completely different area that she doesn't understand at all. So I felt very, very bad about that. But I felt I got to be there for her. I have to. I have to care for her. And I've never regretted that. I've never
Mhm.
regretted this a single minute, even though it was very, very difficult because I also had to take control of all of her finances. I had to sell her house, get it ready to sell. And the paperwork, for prescriptions and everything for a person who's just living, it's very, very complicated, very time consuming. It's really a second job. So for like 5 years of my life, that's what I had to do in addition to my regular job. And my regular job would often take at least 50 hours a week to get the work done. So I was just running myself ragged. But I didn't regret it. I thought that this is
Mhm.
what I got to do. This is a person who needs somebody.
Would you have regretted it had you not done any of those things?
Oh yeah, I would have felt that I had abandoned her.
Mhm.
I um, because it just seems to me that having 1 or 2 parents afflicted with Alzheimer's or dementia, it's almost become like a milestone for most people in my generation. In fact, almost every single one of the people I'm in contact with have had at least one parent who had to end up in just living or nursing home because of dementia or Alzheimer's. And I think you just have to step up and do what needs to be done.
Mhm. I'm asking about this partly for personal reasons because my mother, I believe she has borderline personality disorder, which has the pattern of love bombing someone, then pushing them away, then love bombing, and ad infinitum, ad nauseum. And I had to make the choice eventually to cut her out, and it's been about 9 or 10 years. And where do you think the propensity for insults? Where do you think that came from in your mother?
I think she had a very bad childhood. She grew up during the Great Depression in poverty, or not poverty, but near poverty. Her father abandoned the family. So I know that her circumstances as a girl and as a young woman were very, 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 very difficult. And I think that she became very bitter about life and very distrustful of other people, was not able to maintain friendships throughout her life. And I think she was just very alone and very, very depressed. I sometimes wondered whether she had borderline personality disorder. I
Mm,
don't think so because she never did any of the love bombing. Uh,
mm,
I think, however, that she was a very, very depressed person as a kid. When I was in elementary school and junior high school, I would often come home from school and she would be in bed. It looks as if she spent the whole day in bed, but I didn't even know what depression was back then. Even though I was very depressed myself, I thought that was the human condition, to be miserable and to be sad and about everything.
yeah.
So it wasn't until I got older that I realized, oh my God, my mother has been very, very depressed. And yeah, it was just very difficult because I never had a sense of security.
Mhm,
And when I encountered people who had, a loving mother, I mean, those people had a tremendous boost in life. Uh, so I can understand how you had to totally sever your relation with your mother. And there have even been a number of articles lately. I forget exactly where, but in the major magazines about how that has become necessary, or it's become
Mhm.
more of a trend. And
Yes.
a person I know recently used the term functional estrangement, which I had never heard before. And I looked it up, and that is a standard term now. And I mean, I'm estranged from some people, including one family member.
Mhm.
Uh, but again, despite all the insults, I always felt and continue to feel an extremely strong bond with my mother. And in fact, people often say, I want to grow up and not be anything like my parents. As it turns out, although I felt that way, I've increasingly become like my mother in the sense that I'm doing things that she did. For example, she would almost always, I mean, this was when I was like in my 40s and 50s, she would get on a bus and just walk around downtown Allentown. I'm doing the same thing with Pittsburgh. And it's not as if, I mean, her behavior in downtown Allentown would be as purposeless as my own in Pittsburgh, because I don't do anything in Pittsburgh except walk around.
Mhm. We've talked about some of the heavy stuff, so I want to balance that out by asking what one of your fondest memories are, whether it's in the book or outside of the book. If I had to pick one thing from the book, I would say perhaps it was your trip to Paris, but maybe you can tell me.
Well, I did like that trip to Paris. I was initially very apprehensive about it because of the long flight and everything. And I did love Paris. And in fact, I wish I lived in Paris. That's the one place where I really wish I could live
Mm,
other than New York City. But I wouldn't say that was a happy. I mean, it was a good experience, definitely. But I guess if I had to choose one experience that would be the happiest, it's something I actually did write about in the book in a 45-page paragraph toward the end, in which I recounted some relationships. And it was the first relationship that I recounted in that paragraph that
mm,
I would say probably the happiest time in my life. It was a very brief relationship, a long distance relationship, 6 months with a person
mhm.
in the East Village, a young woman in the East Village, New York City. And I just remembered that I was always so happy about that, even though I knew it was not going to last. But I somehow, in my mind, was able to accept it was not going to last and just enjoy it while it happened. And of course, when it ended, I just completely fell apart. But yeah, I would say that was the happiest time.
Was this the person who kept reminding you that this isn't going to last
Yeah, yeah,
and kept you at sort of arm's length emotionally?
yeah, yeah. That was the
Mhm.
person.
That was hard to read, but I can see, the beauty in there too, the love, even if it was unrequited.
Yeah, and it was. It was. I mean, she did use the word love once, and after saying it, she said, "Did you hear what I just said?" And but
Mhm.
the love did not last long. And I mean, her background was completely different from mine. She came from virtually an
Wow.
aristocratic background,
Mhm.
and I mean, I'm a blue collar kid, and nevertheless, we did really connect.
You write that you found teaching composition to be an unsullying use of my time, a way to keep myself grounded. So now I'm interested, now that you've retired, what do you do to keep yourself grounded, or are you groundless now?
That's a difficult question because I guess what I meant by grounded by my job was that it took up so much time and so much concentration, grading hundreds of papers every semester, and it was a way, I guess, to escape other things in my life. So I sort of had to become a different person as soon as I stepped onto campus, and was able to put an end to those daily feelings as soon as I got home, because I never brought any of my work home with me. But then I would have very few hours to myself because I would be at school so long every day, often 9 or 10 hours a day. So what it it was grounded in the sense that I couldn't do much else. So I guess it was using the word grounded in a kind of ambiguous sense. Grounded in the sense of, a parent grounds the kid who can't go out and play, but also grounded in the sense that it gives you a kind of foundation in life. And I
Mhm.
guess it was doing both of those things. So it really was keeping me away from life, all the hours, uh, uh, because it was just such a time consumptive job. And I never found any shortcuts. There must have been shortcuts that I could have found, but I didn't. So I guess the way that I keep myself grounded now is that I live an extremely unaggrandizing life. I live very, very modestly. on an extremely modest scale. I mean, my big extravagances are going to Burger King twice a week.
Mhm.
So I don't, again, when we were talking about baby boomers earlier, I'm just not like a baby boomer. I'm not an acquisitive person. You know, I don't go out and buy stuff. In fact, now even when I buy a book, I realize somebody's going to have to dispose of this book. I won't be around to, so I guess that's what that I live a very minimalistic
Mhm.
life. And I don't entertain fantasies about, going on a cruise or because I would never do something like that, or even going to Paris again. I mean, I've only been back to New York only once since the pandemic.
Mhm.
Uh,
I feel like you could have thrived in Paris. Is there a particular reason you don't see yourself going back there?
because I would never get on a plane again. And yeah, I don't know when I felt in Paris, even though I couldn't I did learn a few phrases before I went,
Mm,
uh, but I was able to get by. And it was the beauty of the city that overcame me. I mean, Pittsburgh, I like Pittsburgh a lot, but it's not a beautiful city.
mm.
And it seemed that everywhere I turned in Paris, there was beauty. The buildings, everything.
And
And
it's prime people watching,
oh
uh,
yeah,
for sure.
yeah. In fact, I would see these elderly flaneurs. I guess that's how you pronounce it. Uh, these really well dressed old men striding down the boulevards and smiling because there's so much there to see. It's visually intoxicating. And
Mm,
the food that I had there was the best food I ever ate in my life.
mm.
So, but I
I'm
know it's
glad
very,
you did not go to the McDonald's that you mentioned.
yeah,
That would be obscene.
yeah, it would have been, but it would have been something familiar. And there were, uh, I had been sponsored there by a guy who runs an American literature program at a university there. So
Mhm,
he and other associates of his would take me out to dinner. I'd say half the time I was there,
mhm.
so that was a problem. But when I was on my own, I would just buy bread, baguettes and croissants, because I was afraid of going into like a restaurant on my own. So that's why I was sort of tempted to go to McDonald's or Burger King or
Mhm.
KFC, but I didn't go through with it.
I guess I was hoping partly that you would say that, writing now that you're retired, writing could be something that grounds you.
Oh, well, as I said, after I completed the two projects of the worsted book and the backwardness book,
Mhm.
I just completely stopped
Yeah.
writing. And because I felt that I had expressed everything I possibly had to express, that I would be repeating myself if I revisited the material. And I've been reading a lot of John Updike lately, and I noticed that he repeats himself a lot about writing about his childhood and
Mhm.
the homes that he lived at, two homes that he lived in when I was a child. But I never get bored with what he says about it.
I
So,
think the same is true with your writing. You could continue to write about the same things and I wouldn't get bored.
well, thanks. But another thing that occurs to me is that I feel as if I'm run out of words. And I
Yeah.
remember reading a long time ago, um, somebody asked Guy Davenport why he's never written a novel. And his answer was, after the first few chapters, I ran out of words. And I feel that way. I, I mean, I feel very awkward about repeating words. And in
Mhm.
backwardness, that was inevitable. I mean, how can you get around using certain words? I mean, and what I mean by words that I was reusing, uh, there was a very instructive book by Ved Mehta, an Indian writer who was a frequent New Yorker contributor. And he wrote a book called The Gentle Art of Editing. Oh no, it's something like The Gentle Mr. Sean, The Gentle Art of I forget what, but he wrote a book about his experience writing for the New Yorker. And I expected that this would be a very thorough recounting of editorial sessions with William Sean. As it turns out, there was really only one such experience written about in the book, but it was very illuminating because in his first or second piece that he submitted to the New Yorker, he had used a particular word twice, and William Shawn said to him, I make a distinction between two types of words. There are function words and there are color words. Maybe it wasn't color words, maybe it's not like style words. And it was that second category, which be the word that is very carefully chosen for that exclusive context, that one exclusive context in the piece. And he was saying you need to rethink the second use of this.
Mhm.
And that has always struck with me. Although I see people like, for example, John Updike violating that, who use one word in a kind of evocative or poetic sense on one page, and then the very next page you'll see that word again. I've seen that as well in John Ashbery's poetry. So I guess there's justification for repeating a word like that, but I tried to avoid that. But in a book as long as Backwardness, it's impossible.
Yes. Even if we don't get much new fiction from you, I wonder about the possibility of some juvenilia coming out, because you do mention that your college thesis was a collection of stories titled Ordinary Sorrows. And I think you also mentioned another earlier collection. Can you tell me about these and if they'll ever see the light of day?
They'll never see the light of day because, I mean, my MA thesis was a story collection called Ordinary Sorrows, and I guess it would be housed in the college library there because I think everybody who writes a dissertation or a thesis, it ends up in the library. But it's just a terrible book. It's absolutely awful. I would never want to read anything. And as a matter of fact, as far as juvenilia is concerned, I would say the letters in the Backwardness book, those are juvenilia because they were written, as an undergrad and as a
Mhm.
grad student. So then my fiction writing was absolutely terrible back then. It's embarrassingly bad because I was trying to imitate because I thought, well, we were essentially being encouraged to imitate. And I'm not sure what the other book you're referring to because I didn't know. I mean, there's like poems that I wrote because
Mhm.
initially, again, I wanted to be a poet. But there isn't.
So it's just that one collection, Ordinary Sorrows,
Yeah. I
which
know. Oh, I know what you're referring to. I also started writing a creative dissertation. That's probably I'm sure that's
mm,
what you meant. And that's also garbage as well. In fact, I would say that's even worse than the MA thesis stuff
why would you say that that later collection or
because I think
dissertation would be worse?
at that point I already felt that I had already exhausted the little bit of material I had from my own
Mm,
life, and that I was just being wordy. The stories in the dissertation were much longer and it's completely aimless.
mm. You've mentioned that you now these days you have some correspondence with other writers, usually having to do with reading a story with the idea of publishing it. You're kind enough to read my story Protandry, which I wrote for some Brazilian friends who have a press that's called, translated in English, Madam Psychosis, which is
Oh,
tipping the hat to Infinite Jest. But yeah, that was for Hobart, which you contribute your time to as an editor. And you also contribute your time to the press Calamari Archive. Can you tell me about some of your involvement with these two
yeah.
projects?
With Calamari Archive, I first encountered the fellow who runs it. He likes to remain anonymous, and I first encountered him, I guess, sometime in the early in the century
Mhm.
when he would occasionally come to readings that I was giving, and I learned then that he was running a press. And when my first book went out of print, Stories in the Worst Way, when it went out of print, it was reprinted by a small press in Providence, Rhode Island called Third Bed. But then that press went under, and the fellow who runs Calamari said he would like to reprint it. So that was my initial involvement with him. And then I submitted two other books to him. One of which is a grammar book called The Gotham Grammarian, and the other was a story collection called The Horser. And we became friends, the fellow who runs it and I. And I forget the exact sequence, but at some point he moves around a lot. And at one point he was moving to Italy,
Mhm.
and he was no longer going to be able to fill orders for Calamari Archive because they would they would have to be mailed internationally. So he asked if I would be interested in coming aboard as the person who would fill the orders, and that appealed to me because from the time I was a kid, I always wanted to work for a mail order company. I was always fascinated as a kid by mail order companies, and I would send out for stuff. I mean, if I saw something in a magazine that said "send for a free catalog," I would send for the free catalog because I
Yeah.
like getting the stuff in the mail. So I thought this is going to be paradise. I'm going to be filling orders for Calamari Archive. So he, over the course of several weeks, mailed huge boxes of the inventory, and one room in my apartment essentially became the store. So I would fill these orders and take them to the post office, and I was being paid very, very handsomely for doing this. I mean, an amazing amount of money that I was making. What I mean is that, I mean, obviously I wasn't making a huge amount of money, but more money than I thought I would possibly be earning
Mm.
by simply filling envelopes. So, so I was involved there, but then he moved back to the States. He came out here and he rented a van and came out and picked up the inventory. But by then I was already doing copy editing for some of the books that he's publishing. And recently he has dramatically increased the number of books that he publishes because he has shifted, as a number of small presses have now shifted, to the print on demand
Mm.
format. Now, by using this, there's no inventory. You know, a book is printed simply when it is ordered. And because of this, he is now able to increase the number of books that he publishes. I think he's published about 12 in the past year. So I copy edit some of them because, you know, a lot of small presses don't really do any copy editing, or they do very minimal copy editing. And
Mhm.
the fellow who runs the press wants these books to be copy edited exquisitely and, you know, very exactingly and painstakingly.
Mhm.
So I've done some of that. I haven't done any in the past few months because as I get older, I feel less confident about my copy editing, even though I've been obsessed with grammar for decades.
Mhm.
Uh, but I haven't copy edited anything in the past.
Did you copy edit Areshi Young's Codon?
No, no.
Um, I received that from Calamari Archive because I published one of his stories on the Kaleidoscope that appears in that collection. But it's a great Borgesian abstraction, let's say. Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. Though.
Oh no. The fellow who edits Calamari has terrific taste, and he's often been noted for that. And he does tend toward a more avant-garde or experimental type of thing,
Mhm.
but he has published some straightforward fiction as well. And oh, another involvement I had with Calamari was that in two of the print issues of the literary journal that Calamari used to publish called Sleeping Fish, I co-edited two of those issues, and that was a lot of fun as
Mhm.
well. So yeah, the fellow who runs it, he's just amazing, amazing guy, amazing editor, amazing writer himself, and yeah, so it's been very enjoyable to work with him, and with the other press or the other involvement with Hobart Hall. Uh, that's a very interesting, kind of provocative, and somewhat controversial literary journal. And
I was reading a little bit about that. Yes.
yeah, the woman who runs it, Elizabeth Allen, is a very good writer herself. I mean, her work has appeared in Harper's Magazine, among other places. And she has a new book out, a new novel with Class Books called American Thighs. She is very, very interesting as a person because her whole life is revolves around reading and writing. I mean, that's really pretty much all she does. And she has a kind of punk attitude toward publishing. She doesn't shy away from saying things the way they think they should be said. And she published an interview with a Miami writer a couple of years ago that led to a mass defection of the editorial staff from Hobart. So I came aboard after that. And all that Miami writer was saying was that the Big Five publishing scene is pretty much dominated by women in Park Slope who carry tote bags. And that really annoyed a lot of people.
That's part of the reason why I sent you my story because a lot of people would read that and pull their hair out and die of being offended. And so I can relate to the Elizabeth Allen's struggles and even my own website, the Kaleidoscope, Collide. I like to have a collision of opinions and viewpoints and styles, etc. I don't believe in censorship in any way, shape, or form. Rather, I believe in voices, even if those voices disagree with each other.
Yeah, and that's the way I feel, and that's the way Elizabeth feels as well. So, yeah, so Hobart was a perfect setting for your very unusual, very interesting story. And Hobart, well, I guess the whole editorial philosophy at Hobart is one that sort of implies that there's too much homogeneous fiction and poetry out there right now.
Mm.
And I I barely even ever glance at literary journals anymore because I can pretty much predict what I'm going to find. And it doesn't appeal to me. I don't get anything out of it. And
Mm,
as I said earlier, I go into Barnes and Noble and seeing the new fiction and just feeling as if it's in a completely different world, a completely different universe. Like,
mhm, mhm.
I mean, and there's a lot of fiction these days that is written almost in a style identical to the style that you see in feature articles in the classy magazines like New York Magazine or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's again, it's just so predictable and so similar that I have no curiosity about it anymore. It just I know that it's not going to do anything for me. In fact, one thing Lish used to say about writing that he did not like, he would say, "It's not going to help me live or die," and it's so true.
So I would like to end on something of a staple question that I've been trying to nurture with this podcast, and then afterward we'll end with a longer reading. But the question is, what is a book that has had the most profound effect on you, whether in your personal life, your writing life, or all of the above?
Well, I guess it would come in two ways because I mentioned earlier in the interview a book that I stumbled upon at the drugstore called Modern American Usage.
Mhm.
And that was a turning point. Reading that book was a turning point for me, even though, as I said, I didn't understand it, but I kept rereading it, kept buying more copies of it and giving it copies to people um, that I cared about. So that was, but then the second way was when I stumbled upon books edited by Gord Lish, uh, and saw that these were books that focused on the sentence, the individual sentence, and that's when I started writing again because I'd given up writing after leaving grad school. So I came upon these books by Barry Hannah, not knowing who they were edited by, but then it turns out all these books were edited by Lish, and then I started taking the courses, and he would talk about the sentential event. The sentence has to be a thing unto itself. He would talk about a sentence has to achieve infinity in a bounded space, and that appealed to me a lot. So those were the two big impactful. I hate using that word. Influential uh, um, books. I mean, for example, Christine Scott's work. Uh, I just absolutely worship Christine Scott's fiction.
I'll probably have to get to her work finally next, especially if it's going to be a while before you come out with something new. Although I will pick up the reprint of Worsted, which I missed out on the first go round. I
But
have
that's
to
going to be
correct.
out. Yeah, that's going to be out soon because it's going to be print on demand. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, that's the thing. That was published by. I forgot to mention in terms of Hobart that Hobart also Elizabeth Allen also has a small press called Short Flight Long Drive, and she published Worsted. It went out of print, so now so she gave Calamari Archive permission to reprint that as a print on demand book. I made a few tiny changes in phrasing in the
Oh,
book.
really?
And that should be out, I would say, within a month. Because the thing is, with print on demand, stuff comes out really fast. It doesn't take
Yes.
long to get a book up and out in the print on demand format.
I'm looking forward to that. So, next step is if you want to stop and get a sip of water or a sip of soda.
Yeah, could I do that? Because, yeah, I'll be
Sure
back
thing.
in a minute. Okay. Okay, I should mention that these excerpts are consecutive excerpts in a section of the book that deals with my experience during a leave of absence from my teaching job when I went to work for a music magazine. So there's references to, I guess, working at the magazine. In the last minutes of my lunch half hour, the bulk of which I spent at a table for two in McDonald's, eating a solitary hamburger and trying to classify on an index card the improbable fauna thriving in neighboring booths, I trickle my way up sulphurous Penn Street to the Revco drugstore. It's already slated to be closed for good. I snap up a packet of M&Ms from a wire rack and fall in line behind a bird-legged old Pennsylvania Dutch lady who's buying a box of Band-Aids. The clerk, a no-nonsense Puerto Rican woman in the twilight of her 40s, is having a hard time fitting the box into a small plastic bag, and frustrated, she says, "Oh boy." Nourished by this little crumb of human contact, the old Dutch lady ventures, "Oh boy, that's my favorite word. For years it's been. Only I catch holy heck at home when I say it." The cashier doesn't even acknowledge this outburst, but as the old Dutch lady inches her way to the door and my purchase is being rung up, I try to imagine the kind of airless, floweredly wallpapered household no doubt reeking of beer and kerosene, where the phrase, "oh boy," innocently exclaimed in the sepulchral hollows of a midweek afternoon, gets a parched-looking old woman into such big trouble. At least she has some Band-Aids now. Late last week, the radiator in my office sprang a series of leaks, staining the beige carpeting in an ever-widening semicircle. Only at first, I didn't see any relationship between the stain and the radiator. The first few days, there was a foot-long stretch of dry, unstained carpet between the radiator and the soaked, stained part, and I figured somebody's been pissing on this rug. At first, in fact, I hadn't even noticed the stain. I stare at a green computer screen for most of the day, and when I swivel radiatorward, it's only to look out the window at the Puerto Ricans who always gather outside the health clinic across the street. I've grown partial to the women. Their lives seem concise and complete. It was Franklin, my boss, who finally brought the stain to my attention. Maybe the ceiling leaks, I said. I tried to work the muscles of my face into something approximating an obliging, speculative expression. But my mind was already establishing an occult relationship between the moist yellow Rorschach blot on the carpet and my night-long medicine dropper like piddling into my bedside pitcher. I've had these enlarged prostate symptoms for half a decade already. Franklin said, "Do you remember me spilling anything in here?" I said, "Not while I was in here anyway." Then earlier this week, he took charge. He began ministering to the radiator, a radiator with a wheezy little voice, practically sarcastic, by arranging small plastic cups and then an ice cube tray beneath its sissing tubes. But yesterday, as the stain spread even farther into the room, it was now as large as a sidewalk square, he called a plumber. The plumber was a bearish, bearded man who showed up a few hours later and pronounced the radiator dead. "You're looking at $350 at least for a new one," he said, with tradesman solemnity. "Used will run you maybe $100, $125 if you're lucky to find one." Franklin decided against the repair, but let the plumber fix the toilet. It used to be flushable only once every couple of hours or so. There's a powder blue crustacean on the seat that I keep thinking of as petrified Ajax. Driving home tonight, I held the steering wheel with my left hand and my microcassette recorder in my right. For the length of the drive, it took up both sides of the tape. I ranted and fumed and thundered about everything wrong with my life. Tomorrow morning, driving back to work, I'll erase the tape. Sunday, regained consciousness at 7:54 a.m., and before a minute had passed, the day already seemed shot. I did a little desultory reading in the newspaper, waved aside some vinegary expostulations to pick up after myself, pegged away at my word processor for an hour or so, and then made my loose-gated way down Union Boulevard to the Valley Farm Market, formerly Tropical Market. The store was aswarm with the after-church crowd in their holy day gaudery, along with a crush of gypsy women and cabana kids. I bought a little Delmonico steak, a pan fry, and a bowl of frozen chicken noodle soup. This is my fourth consecutive day without French fries. Friday, however, I could not follow through with my Burger King grilled chicken sandwich routine because I was supposed to drop off a parcel at Budget Printer, which is in the opposite direction. So I once again sat among the McDonald's aristocracy of dementia and despair. Those crustaceous golden agers who, having been flushed out of their oubliettes and dovecoats and cocklots for the afternoon, bivouac in booths and cup their chins in their palms. Hollow-eyed and cherry-nosed, they marinate in their gastric juices, hourly renewing vengeful vows and occasionally stirring to buy a soft-serve cone or petition for a cup of ice. Staying with my parents has been okay so far. Friday morning, on my way to work, I stopped at the Wescosville Amico station, where once a fortnight or two, I've been letting a walrusy fellow nozzle out a tankful of regular unleaded and check my oil. He had the hood propped open, and I was reposing in my seat, listening to Howard Stern and trying to look cool and unfazed, when, after funneling some oil into the oil tank or crankcase or wherever the oil goes, Mr. Walrus wheeled around and sprinted into the office for a fire extinguisher. Clouds of smoke and then flames were shooting up from the engine. Mr. Walrus aimed the fire extinguisher at the flames, then rushed over to my window and blurted, "Better pull up to the bay so I can get the hose." I complied and turned up the volume of the radio as he sprayed the engine for a good 2 minutes. "Heh heh," he said. "I must have dropped a few drops of oil down the engine," he explained. "Happened to my kid once. Car caught fire a mile or so down the road. Wouldn't want that to happen to a customer. That'll be $13.50 altogether." A week and a half ago, it was a Tuesday morning, I began to smell something awful on my drive to work. It wasn't the stench of the mushroom factories or the usual diesel stink of the trucks on the highway or some septic disturbance in Dutchland. When puffs of smoke began to waft up from the seamed cracks at the edge of the hood of my car, I drew a mental connection between the stench and the smoke, but I drove on. I later learned from a grave-talking junior mechanic that my voltage regulator, see glossary, was sending too much juice through the electrical system. That explains the full complement of burned out headlamps and brake lights over the past few days, and overpowering the battery. The upshot was a sleepover in Reading and a reaming out from a hateful AAA tow truck operator who boiled over when I botched the answer to the question about whether I had front or rear view drive. The man who took care of me at the H&R Block office on Linden Street in downtown Allentown, I had my doubts that he was a real accountant, was so obese that I could never get a clear sense of just how old he might be. But I came away from the session, I was there for a good 75 minutes, with a suspicion that he was probably just shy of 25. He seemed to be wearing knee pads or knee girdles to keep the voluminous flesh of his thighs from plummeting floorward. One leg of his greasy polyester pants had a large hole above the knee, and a large hole in his t-shirt was visible under his body-hugging sports shirt. At one point, a colleague of his, a bearded, rumpled fellow, cheerily announced that he was on his way to McDonald's for an Egg McMuffin and asked for a loan of $6. After much fumbling and much displacement of flesh, the taxman produced a crumpled wad of bills and handed over 6 of them. Then he tucked a few dollar bills into a corner of his desk pad. Then he resumed his calculations. He confirmed that my McDonald's and Burger King lunches did indeed count as a business expense. I owed a lot, though, to the nation, to the state, and to the locality. He charged me $75, which worked out to about $1 a minute. Thursday night, motoring homeward through a residential stretch of Fifth Street, one of Reading's sclerotic arteries, this one lined with turreted row houses in late-stage disrepair, I was giving plenty of room to a cough-drop red sports car, a sleek, low-slugged, up-to-the-minute number, evidently a Corvette of some sort, that was alternately careering and loitering its way through the asphalt expanses ahead of me. When the driver abruptly, but I'm convinced deliberately, veered to the right and broadsided the parked car, a weather-beaten sedan, then shot forward into the streams of traffic, I made a half-hearted attempt to memorize the license plate number. I don't mind feeling a little citizenly every once in a while. A mile or so later, when Fifth Street broadens into a highway flanked by shopping centers well past their prime, I saw the Corvette again, now in the passing lane. The driver was waiting to make a left-hand turn. Most of the car's left side, from the passenger's door to the rear bumper, was shorn off. Mortal? Franklin recommended that I check out a used bookstore called Bigger Fish. It's situated in an outlet district maybe 15 blocks from the office. Since the 4th issue of the magazine I've worked on was put to bed late on Wednesday night, he sent me home an hour and a half early on Friday afternoon, after calling the bookstore to find out how late they're going to be open. Closing time is 5:30, and I left the office at 5:05. I parked half a block from the store at 5:15, and as soon as I crossed the threshold, the owner, a cagey old guy, looked at me and said, "You the guy that called?" Not wanting to say, actually, that was my boss, I simply nodded. He said, "Well, I'd rather be at home making my supper, but I'll wait." I cased the joint. Just 4 aisles of books, the usual junk shop selection. Much of the stock was weathered and smelly. I felt I had better buy something, but the books weren't even priced. About 10 minutes later, I presented myself at the counter with 2 hardcovers, both of which I could have lived without. I already owned each of them in a different edition. I figured the pair together wouldn't set me back more than $3 or $4. The owner flipped through the 2 books and then snapped $8 plus 48 cents for the governor. I reached into my wallet for a 10 spot and handed it over. The old guy counted out my change and slapped it on the counter, then had another look at one of the books. He said, "Hold it a second. Where did you find that S.J. Perelman?" I said, "In the humor section." He said, "Are you sure? I don't remember ever shelving that." I said, "That's where I found it." He said, "You positive?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Don't tell me my daughter put it there. I can't believe she'd do a thing like that. Let me see that thing again." Oh, geez. Cheese and crackers almighty. Okay, look, there's nothing I can do. You bought the book. There's been a sales transaction here. Buyer, seller, 2 parties. Money has changed hands. It's yours. But wait, give me a minute. Let me look look it up in the price guide. Hold on. Then he fetched some thick thing, turned some pages, paused, then slammed it shut. He said, "Looks like you got yourself a pretty good book." Then, after a pause, "Too bad the dust jacket's torn like that. And it's a shame about the spine. Pages look a little loose. The clutch on them is practically shot. Whole thing will probably start losing pages before you even know it. That gonna bother you? You're gonna need pretty big rubber bands to hold this sucker together. You do realize it's not a first edition. Still, that's a pretty book. That's a pretty good book you just got for yourself there, buddy. You made out." On a shelf near my workstation was a tumble of women's magazines someone had dumped there months ago. I snatched a handful by their spines and splayed them open across my desktop. Subscription cards flapped up at me. I tore them out, squared them into a neat pile. Then I charged through the back pages of the magazines and scissored out all the clip and mail blanks for anything free: samples, catalogs, trial issues, brochures. These I put into another pile. At first, I could not decide whether the piles themselves were an accomplishment or just a rehearsal for an accomplishment.
Garielle, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for being so open. And most importantly, thank you for your writing, which is truly a literary light in the illiterate darkness.
Thank you so much, George. I really enjoyed this, and thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you. Take care now.
You too. Bye.
There you have it. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you want more Lutz, be sure to check out my late 2022 text interview at thekaleidoscope.com. And of course, be sure to pick up a copy of Backwardness from Short Flight, Long Drive. If you'd like early access to content like this and other awesome benefits, then consider supporting the Kaleidoscope's efforts through patreon.com/The Kaleidoscope. There's always more in the works, so stay tuned. And thanks so much for your support.